Okay, so writing the perfect clause. Has anyone on here received a lovely message from one of the broker team that says, congratulations on your sale, for further reference on any of their clauses?
Yes.
You say that with such excitement. Okay, so one of the biggest things in real estate is we quite often know that you know, you go through some inspections and you find out something's, you know, needs to be replaced. You want to have the seller replace it. It's in the best interest of your buyer. This is if you're working for the buyer. We're going to change hats a couple times. So if it's unclear at any time to you who I'm talking to about, if I'm not clear that this is the benefit of the buyer or the benefit of the seller, stop me. Because of course, I'm used to, in my own head, I know who I'm talking about, not necessarily on the teaching aspect of it. So if you've got a buyer that's just gone through an inspection, and let's say the hot water tank, because that's a fairly common one, needs to be replaced. It's very important that it's worded the right way. And can anyone tell me why it matters the way it's written? Can you just throw out anything? Like, there's no right or wrong answers here, really. It's just about learning, so don't be shy. Nobody has any idea why a clause needs to be written correctly. Okay, I'm going to lead you down the path. So you have said, you wrote an amendment and says the hot water tank needs to be replaced. Period. Who's going to replace the tank? It doesn't say who's going to replace the tank. It just says the tank needs to be replaced. That's not compelling the seller to have to do anything. Can you see where that might be a problem? You show up on day of closing and, oh, there's no new oil, no new hot water tank, because you didn't actually say that the seller had to do it. So that's one very valid reason. Another reason would be, so it's a little bit harder with a hot water tank. I mean, there's cheaper brands, but I think they're fairly consistent. But let's say that you want a oil tank to be replaced and you want a fiberglass one, but you just say that the seller is to replace the oil tank for day of closing, but you don't say what kind. You're going to get whatever you get. You have no say at that point. So you need to be very specific about exactly what it is that needs to be replaced. Has anyone here wrote the replacing an oil tank clause yet? Tanya, I'm sure, Tanya or Anita, I don't mean to pick on you, but I'm sure one of you have asked the oil tank to be replaced by this point in your career.
Ah, not yet.
You haven't? Okay, Anita?
Septic system, though. That was a little crazy.
Okay, well, that one's a very intense one. I mean, they're all basic premises all the same. Okay. So you guys are understanding, you're starting to get a feeling as to why I'm saying it's important to know exactly what it is that you're asking for and making sure it's very clear what is actually being done. You want to protect your client. So what you always have to remember is who I'm working for. Most of the time, not always, but most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, when you're asking for something to be done, you're working for a buyer. Okay. That doesn't mean as a seller's agent that you don't have to review a clause when you receive it. But let's start with the buyer one first. So under point number 2, how it changes depending on whom I'm representing. So when you're representing your buyer, you want to make sure you're going to get them the Cadillac, you're going to get them the best thing that you can get them, and you're going to be the rock star for your client. Okay. When you show up on day of closing, you already know that the oil tank or the septic system, or it doesn't matter if it's a light fixture, you're going to know that it's been replaced and it's been done correctly, because you're going to write the clause in such a way that they have no choice but to do so. Otherwise, the lawyers will get involved and they'll correct anything that's not done correctly. The reason why I say you'll know before closing it's done, can anybody tell me a guess as to why you would know before closing that the item was replaced? Okay, I either have a group that doesn't want to join, you guys just really haven't had to write this clause very much.
Well, you wouldn't want it to go right to the date of closing, or the closing date will move on, I suspect, if you can't inspect it at least a day or two before.
Right. So what kind of experience would your buyer have on that?
I guess that would hold up moving day, so moving costs.
Right.
Place to stay overnight.
Yes.
Yeah.
Homeless clients is never a good thing.
Oh, I missed that, Tammy.
I said a homeless client is never a good thing.
No.
So the other piece to that is we form really good relationships with our clients, and they love the fact that we negotiate on their behalf. So we've taken the stress off of all these repairs that need to be done, perhaps in a home inspection, and we've wrote them all and the seller signed it. So those buyers, they don't understand all the minutia of all these deals and the legal aspects of wording, because it's very important with wording. So you show up on day of closing and half the stuff that you asked for wasn't done, or it wasn't done professionally or properly. Closing is going to get held up, and your clients are not going to remember how great of a job you did negotiating the price or negotiating anything in the beginning. All they're going to leave away from that deal is the poor experience they had in closing. That is not what we want, okay? We always want our clients to be our biggest cheerleaders, quick to refer us because we do such an excellent job. Poorly written clauses is one of the first things that can actually ruin the relationship with a buyer very, very quickly. It leaves a sour taste when they don't get the keys when they're supposed to, right? Or they, thought they were getting a new oil tank, and guess what? There isn't a new oil tank, but you didn't protect them, so the lawyer can do nothing about it. Okay, so let's go into the point of view in reading. The other point I wanted to make on the reason why you would know something was replaced prior to closing is because that's the way you're writing it in your clauses. It's not about closing, it's about a specific date, and you're also compelling them to make sure they provide the receipts minimum 2 days prior to whatever your closing date may be. So just to clarify that a little bit more, I want an oil tank changed. I want it changed by a professional, and I want it to be a fiberglass tank. I'm going to say that it has to be replaced. My closing is July the 29th. I want all this work done by July 25th, and I want all the receipts provided to myself by July 25th. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
And why would this be a good practice to make sure you have minimum 2, but 5 business days to have those receipts in your hands?
Well, because then you'll know that it was done professionally, and also if there's any issues, you have a couple more days to deal with it before closing.
Perfect. That's exactly the reason. Because again, we're tying ourselves back to the closing day. I'm assuming, has every agent on Zoom today had at least one closing?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Matt? You're muted, Matt. Oh, there we
I'm
go.
actually just starting out with the commercial division in Halifax. I'm not yet licensed, so no.
Okay. Okay. So it's maybe a little bit harder for you to wrap your head around this where you haven't actually gone to a closing date. Commercial is going to be slightly different than residential, but so actually the things that you might be asking to be replaced might even be even more expensive things. So the premise is the same. So closing day comes. So with a business, you might not actually have a human moving into a home, but still the biggest problem that we have with residential is the minute that we don't sign off saying that everything's okay on our final walkthrough, then the lawyers are involved. And we love our lawyers. I mean, they protect our clients, but they take forever to get things resolved. And therefore, in the middle of that, you have a client and I have a consumer that's not getting their keys. And again, when it comes to housing, it's a little bit more important because you don't want them homeless. We say that quite often because we want to really make a person realize how important this is, because until the money changes hands, you cannot release those keys to that client. So they cannot move in that house. They could have moving vans all lined up that they're going to have to now pay extra money for. They might have to try to find hotels. So we try to eliminate all the closing day problems previous so that it goes so much smoother and we have a happy transition. So that's the main reason behind that. Okay. So when you have the receipts, you can provide them to your lawyer. So your lawyer's looking for you to know whether or not all of this work's been done. Because the other piece of this, when we write a clause, is if we've asked for XYZ to be replaced on or before date, and it's not done, the second part of writing the perfect clause is, if it is not done, then there will be a holdback with the buyer's lawyer and trust, money not to be released until the work is done. Okay, so that's your protection against, even though you've told someone they have to do it, you've written it in such a very clear way that says professionals to do it by XYZ date, receipts to be given. There are still some humans out there that don't have the money. They're not going to do it. They're just going to not worry about it till closing day and let the lawyers fight it out. And again, that delays things for your clients and leaves them with a bad taste. So once we have the backup in place that says the amount will be held by the buyer's lawyer, you're golden. So it might not be done, but your client will at least at minimum have the money to do the oil tank replacement or whatever it is that we've asked for. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, one of the questions we get quite often is, how do I get these quotes? How do I know how much something's going to cost? Does anyone want to throw the answer to that out? No? Okay. I have such an interactive group today.
Well,
So,
you call and get a quote.
right. And you call and get a quote from,
Well, from somebody that's going to replace an oil tank, a company, a professional company that's going to come in and do the work. And then you have a quote. At least you have some idea of what that whole back will have to be once you write that.
Perfect. And why would that be important, Nita? Why wouldn't you just throw a number on the paper saying, oh, I think it's going to cost X amount?
Because it could cost more than that. You might say it's only $1,000, but it could cost more than that.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's perfect. And prices change so frequently. So you might have done an oil tank replacement 6 months ago, but the oil tank replacement now, the prices might have went up and you may not know that, so you haven't protected your client. The other piece to that is there's also not just the oil tank itself that needs to be replaced. You also have to remember that it's all the bits that go to the oil tank as well. All the lines have to be up to today's standard. And, you know, this house might have a lot more coated line than what the other home did. So you're leaving your clients exposed to not having enough money to do the job should the seller not do it. Okay, so that's why it's very important. Now, in some cases when you cannot possibly get a quote, you can actually write a clause that says, if not done, then a holdback determined by the lawyers on closing will be held.
Oh, that's a good one.
Now, I'm going to caution you, don't make this the one that you use on every clause because it's very vague and it also can cause delays because then we've got lawyers trying to figure out how much this thing is going to cost. So this is something that you only use when the time is of the essence and you have no other recourse to do so. Okay, does that make sense, Tanya?
It does.
Right.
What would be a good example of something that we would leave up to the lawyers? I'm just trying to think.
Well, I mean, it could be the oil tank, and I mean, normally we can think enough times. Like usually, if you write $2,500 in the valley for an oil tank, you're okay. But let's say it's a very complex septic system, and you haven't been able to get the septic guys there because they're swamped and they're just too busy to get there. You might need to buy yourself some time. So what I would suggest, if you do have to use that as a fallback, you still end up getting a quote before closing from a septic installation company. Right? So just because you haven't spelled out, you know, the $15,000 and the actual amendment, you still have time between the amendment and closing to make sure you have a good number in case the lawyer should need it for day of closing. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right. Again, that's like a, you know, you're right up to the wire on your timing. You've got to get the amendment in. You can't get the septic people there. The seller doesn't want to extend your conditions, so you have time to get a proper quote, right? So again, and when you run into any of these situations, that's a call to one of the broker team to help guide you through. This is the situation we're in. We know this needs to be replaced. I can't get a quote on XYZ. What do I do? And this is where we'll walk you through that.
Okay.
Okay. So the other part of this, like they're talking about the point of view and reading and drafting clauses as a sellers and as the buyers. We've talked strictly right now as a buyer's agent. Let's switch hats for a minute, and you're the seller's agent. So you're representing who? I know you guys know this.
The seller.
Perfect. Hi, Joanne. Good to see you.
Hi. I
Hi.
just hit a button. I dropped the phone and it just came on. I don't know what I did.
That's okay. It's great to see your beautiful face and a lovely smile. So
Thank
you're right.
you.
So whoever answered, I believe it was Matt. You're the seller's agent. You are representing the seller. So anything you're interpreting has to be to the benefit of the seller. So let's say you received an offer from, it would be an outside agent. It wouldn't be one of ours, of course. That was terribly written. And it said that the seller is to replace the septic the seller is to have a new drilled well, and that's all they said, period. They didn't say anything else. You're obligated to protect your seller in the fact that you don't want the closing day to be terrible for them either. Okay, so the very first thing I would do if I received such a poorly written piece of paper is I would call the other agent and say, this isn't really enough. What is it you're actually asking us? I guess when we say septic, you would think that you would know that they're replacing the septic system. But saying replacing a septic is not necessarily asking for the whole entire septic system to be replaced, because there's different components. It could be just the holding tank. It could be a line. It could be a line that's plugged. And quite often we see sags in lines. That's not the entire septic system. So your seller really would have no idea what's being asked of them. And they would be saying, you, what is it we need to do? When you're reading that, you have no flipping clue as to what they're actually asking you. So pick up the phone, have a conversation with the other agent, and always come from it as a, oh my goodness, I'm reading this, but we're just not really clear. Like, don't ever be like, you're an idiot, you wrote a bad clause or anything like that, because you're never going to get anywhere with the other side. You always want to try to be, you know, nice. And I'm not that any of you guys wouldn't be anything less than nice, but sometimes when you read something like that, you're like, oh my, like, do they even have a broker? Like, where are they coming from? Put all that aside, just ask the questions. And then if they're really stuck with not being able to write a proper clause that your seller knows exactly what needs to be done, you can write it. You can reject their amendment and then propose a new amendment that clearly lays out what the seller is going to do, but there's no extras. You're going to make sure the seller is doing the bare minimum. So if it's only a septic line that needs to be a septic or sewer line that has a sag that needs to be brought up, then you'll just say XYZ will replace the line on or before X date. You won't put a holdback clause in that particular case. Does that make sense to everybody? Because your seller is going to do it, and you're going to ensure your seller is going to do it. Okay. Anything that a buyer's agent brings you to your client needs to be clear, concise, so that basically anybody can understand exactly what needs to be done. And we always want to have a date. Historically, we've seen a lot of amendments that write on or before closing. Does anybody have any insight as to why we actually at KW do not allow that? Other than Tanya and Anita, because I think they both know.
Yeah.
Okay, so I won't torture you on this one. So technically, closing is when money changes hands. Do you really want them in there putting a new septic in the minute the lawyer money changes hands, when you've got your buyers moving in or your seller moving out? You want this work done for your walkthrough. Because on your final walkthrough, that's when, if things aren't done, that's when the lawyers are holding money back. Does that make sense to everybody? So when we put in a date, then we also are compelling the other side to provide us with those receipts for that date. And then, you know, if you don't have the receipts by that date, the work's probably not done. The very next thing you're going to do is you're going to put your lawyer on notice. That lawyer is going to talk to the other side and say, we've just been informed the receipts have not come in for the septic replacement. You might want to check with your client, because if not, I'm prepared to hold $15,000 of your client's money, because that's how we've written the clause. Make sense? Okay, I'm not hearing any big no's.
Yes, Tammy, makes sense.
Yes.
Mhm.
So the required components to a great clause. So A, who is responsible to arrange and be liable for the task? So again, you have to put your hat on. Who are you working for? And as I said earlier, like 99% of the time, I honestly feel it's the buyer's agent that's going to be involved in doing this. So you need to make sure that when you write this clause, that you clearly indicate who is responsible to arrange and be liable. So what we mean by that is we don't just say the septic needs to be replaced. We spell it right out, and it might seem a little silly to spell it out, but you really need to, because again, lawyers are really good at loopholes. So who is going to be responsible? It's going to be the seller that's going to be responsible, okay? And who's going to be liable? So the seller at the seller's expense is how we start off every single clause when we're asking for something to be replaced. You can carry that on a little bit further, and I may end up talking about things 2 or 3 times here, and I apologize if I do, but it just tends to be the nature of this class. So do you want Uncle Joe putting a septic system in the property that your new buyers are going to be buying?
Goodness, no.
No.
Exactly. So you not only are going to spell out that the seller is going to, at their expense, hire a professional septic installation company. And you also need to reference that the septic needs to be done by QP2. So actually, instead of saying qualified septic installation company, I guess I would probably say by QP2 company, period, and word it nicely all together in one sentence. And who pays for it? Well, we've already said the seller's expense. There might be times when you have an amendment that says that the seller is responsible to have it to be installed, X price comes off the property. You can do that as well for a lower price, or a higher price, I should say, in that particular case. But most of the time, we're not doing that, not in our first negotiations. Most of the time, we're just asking the seller to do it, pay for it, and give receipts, okay? So C is where I touched on who will physically do the work. So again, and I say Uncle Joe, Uncle Bob, I use those terms quite often because I say to clients, we don't really want your Uncle Joe or Uncle Bob doing your home inspection because they're not trained to make sure that they don't miss things. They don't check every electrical plug. They don't check every cabinet door. They just don't look at things in a systematic method the way a home inspector does. And so again, when you're looking at your clients and you want something done, we always want it done by a professional. Now, if the seller comes back and says, my husband does this for a living and your buyer's okay with it, fine. But you just need to make sure that you set the expectation as to who's going to do it. I don't think there's very many people that would try to put their own septic system in, but what if it was a deck? If you want a deck repaired, everybody thinks that they can build decks because everybody watches HGTV. You need permits. You need to do things in a safety manner. And so that's the other piece of this too. If there's something like a deck that's being built, you want to tie in the clause that the necessary said permits are obtained. And you also want proof of those as well. You can see why that would be so important with a deck. Stop me at any time if you guys have any questions or if I'm not clear, okay? So D, what are the specifics of the tasks that are to be done? Are you attaching details and or quotes? So it's always the best if you do actually have a very specific quote that outlines sag and line, new cover on the tank, with an oil tank. The one that I use for oil tanks is the seller at their expense is to replace the existing oil tank with a new steel double-walled. Actually, I don't use that anymore. I ask for fiberglass. I don't always get it, but I always ask for the best. With any and all lines being replaced with the proper quoted as per current insurance regulations by a qualified oil tank installation company. Can you see how I've not really given them much opportunity to do anything other than what I've asked? Hot water tanks, sometimes you want a specific brand name. If you want a specific brand name and size, make sure that you spell that out. Historically, we've seen where, agents may have asked for a hot water tank, but they didn't ask for the 200-gallon one. You get there on closing date and you've got one that's that half the size that you see in the mini homes. Too bad. You didn't say you wanted a 200-gallon, or you didn't say same size and quality of current one. All these different scenarios you have to think about, right? So the details and quotes makes it much easier. Like I said earlier, you can't always get them. I'm going to suggest that, anyone on this call, if you get to a situation where you don't have enough time to get the proper quote, call one of the broker team and we will definitely walk you through that because it is a little bit more tricky on your wording for sure. So E, so when does the work have to be done? We've already discussed that. I tend to get ahead of myself when I'm doing this. So at least if you hear it 4 or 5 times, it will stick, right? So when do you want it done? You don't want it before closing. We've already discussed the reason for that. Again, I suggest 5 days prior to the actual date of closing, if it's possible. 2 days works as well. It's just if you have 5, you've got a little extra time to get the lawyers to talk with each other or to get a quote at the last minute if you didn't actually have a current quote, okay? Proof that the task was done. Well, what better proof than receipts? If they're doing it themselves and you've allowed them to do something themselves that they can't have a receipt for, and I'm just trying to think what a small repair, let's say there was 5 deck boards that needed to be replaced on a deck, and you were okay with the seller doing it because the seller was a carpenter. Because we all know carpenters' homes get finished last or repaired last. That's the standing joke. So there's 5 boards that need to be replaced. You're allowing the seller to do it. They forgot to keep the receipt for the lumber. Or maybe they own a construction company and there really is no receipt because they just took it out of a pile of lumber that they already have. Can anybody tell me what proof would be before you walking through on the final day? What could you accept as proof?
A picture.
Perfect, a picture. Because then you've got proof that it was done, and you're going to follow up with that when you get there on day of closing. Now, this is a very unique situation because most of the time there would be a receipt of some sort for services provided or material purchased. But I'm just trying to go out on a stretch to provide you with a case that might not be possible, so you understand what I mean by that. So do you want the right to inspect the task prior to it being approved? Can you think of any circumstances where a person might want to go and have a look at work that's being done before everything's been sent off to you for closing date?
Make sure all the garbage, if there's garbage, cleaned up in the yard.
Yep. Yeah, you might want to see that previous too. I know myself personally, if we had a beautiful backyard and we were asking for a septic installation to be put in, and we're not familiar with the work that this company is going, whoever the sellers chose to do, I may want to go and have the client and me do a walkthrough on the backyard to make sure that they've at minimum smoothed the lands and seeded it. But again, if I didn't ask for that, I might not get that. So I'd have to be very specific in that. In my septic one, I say that, I'm just kind of reading one I've got written up here because I don't keep all these things directly in my head. Grounds to be left as close to original state as reasonably possible and workmanship in a professional workmanship manner. Now, if you're going to ask for the right to go back and inspect something after the work's been done, you need to write that in there. So you're basically asking for a second, or well, I shouldn't say a second inspection. You're asking to inspect the work that was done. And again, you're going to say by X date. So if you're asking them to do something by July 25th, subject to a satisfactory inspection by buyers and buyer's agent by no later than July 27th. Closing's 29th. So you can see how we're tying our dates that we've got time to fix things before it's the day of, oh my God, my whole house is packed up in this van. It's going to cost me $600 if I don't unload it today, because I don't know how many of you had experience with these moving companies, but they're not very friendly when they can't unload when they want to. And the cost just goes up, right? So we're trying to alleviate as many of those issues that possibly could happen. So now what happens if the task is not completed at all? I think we've discussed this, but let's discuss it a little bit further. So what happens if you didn't ask to re-inspect something and 2 days before closing, you still haven't got receipts, the other agent's gone radio silent, you can't reach them, you can't do anything. You arrange your inspection, because they will at least send you a text and say, yes, you can do your walkthrough. You show up and the oil tank was not replaced. Now what? What are you going to do besides freak out and call me? The very first thing you're going to do is you're going to call the buyer's lawyer. Okay. Now, if you've written your clause in all the ways that we've already discussed, you don't have to worry about it. You can just say to your client, it's okay. We wrote it for a holdback. Your lawyer's going to close this deal. You're going to get your keys, and they're going to keep the money so that you can call and you can get the oil tank installed, and the money's there to do it. Can you see how much less stressful that would be for a buyer on the closing date? If you hadn't have wrote the holdback, then the lawyer gets a little bit excited sometimes, because they're like, well, we need to get a quote. Who can you get? And the next thing you know, you're running around and coordinate trying to get somebody there. So it's still more ideal to make sure that you've got the what if. So whenever you receive an email from one of the broker team, if your clause isn't written that way, that's exactly what we're going to say. And we're going to take you back to this. And at some point, the video, Anne did teach this class, but the video didn't get saved. So once Anne teaches the course, just because she is a way better teacher, I'm just going to be real on that. So once we've got her video for the future, if we flag you in anything, we're going to ask you to go back and rewatch that video, because it's very important to have the what if or the dates. Does that make sense so far? We've already talked about completed properly, but not 100%. We haven't talked about that. So let's say you show up, and this one I can see, you could have an oil tank that they didn't replace the lines. So it's going to be the same type of scenario. You're going to call the buyer's lawyer and say, they did half the job. They didn't do all the job. Now, your holdback would be for the full amount of the oil lines and the tank. So you might have to give a quick call and get your oil guy or someone to come out and give another quote on the holdback. Or the lawyer might just say, fine, I'm keeping the whole holdback done until the work's done. Because the way the holdbacks are written is that once work's completed, excess funds are returned to the seller. So it's not a money grab. And we write it that way on purpose so that the seller doesn't think, oh my God, they're just trying to get $2,500 out of us when the job's only going to cost $22,000. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Perfect. Same as a septic. If you show up and they've only done, like, excuse the French, but a half-assed job, they didn't level it, they didn't seed it, and that was something that you specifically said, you're going to call the lawyer. They're going to work out a holdback between the two lawyers. Because at that point in time, if you spell this out properly, your job is done. You did everything you could, short of inspecting it a couple days prior. So in the last point on how are you determining the cost and or the consequence of the above, we have discussed quite a bit, actually. So I don't think we need to continue on that unless someone's not clear on how we determine if something wasn't done properly without a holdback. Does anyone have any questions and even suggestions or ideas that they've ran into? We're welcome. This is very interactive. No? Okay. I think we covered that pretty much. Between, rushing out and getting a quote, you should already have a quote. If you don't, then sometimes the lawyers will be satisfied enough for their own quote. We always try to make sure, though, that we have it ready to go, because the lawyers do, unfortunately, tend to complicate things. Their brains don't work quite the same way we do. They're not out in the field the way we are, working with the professionals. So they do really rely on us for most of those quotes. A big one that, so you show up on day of closing, and someone's already mentioned this about garbage earlier, and this is a problem, because we may not have written this in an amendment, because we shouldn't have to, because it clearly says on the APS, free of debris. We show up in closing and there's like mounds and mounds of garbage that they pulled out of the attic and they pulled out of the basement, and they just bagged it out and threw it out in the yard. You're not going to let your buyer be responsible for that. Okay, so that's where you call the lawyer and say, there's a ton of garbage here. We need a holdback so that the buyers do not have to deal with this garbage. You may, closing may get delayed a bit on that until they figure out how much that's going to cost. That's not really a quote you can have ahead of time waiting for this to happen, because you didn't know it was even going to be an issue. Right? So sometimes you do got to scramble very quickly, but when that happens, you just reassure your client that you're working on it between you and the lawyer. You'll get it figured out, and they will not be responsible for dragging all that garbage to the dump. Okay? Anytime you run in situations like that you need a professional that you don't already have in your arsenal, reach out to one of us, reach out on the KW Select Inner Office Facebook. Quite often you'll see people looking for, hey, do you have a guy that does this? Do you have someone that does that? If you're in a pickle, though, on day of closing like that, I would suggest you give a call in a city, honestly, I wouldn't have people for you, unfortunately. So in this particular case, I would say call Anne, Sherry, or Melissa, or a fellow agent that you do a lot of work with, maybe someone that you've mentored with. They'll have a list of professionals they'll be able to help you with. If it's in the Valley, I can definitely help you with most professionals, but unfortunately not in HRM. Okay, point number 4. So how do I deal with a poorly written clause by another party to the deal? So we did talk about that early on. Can you give me an example of why that might be so important? You're the seller's agent and you've received a poorly written amendment, and you're not really sure what to do with it, but you present it to your seller and your seller's like, oh yeah, I have no problem replacing that line. Can you foresee any issue that might happen to the seller? So the buyer's agent shows up on closing, and what they really meant to say is that they wanted to have the entire line from the septic to the holding tank and then to the field replaced. But it just read that they wanted the line to the septic replaced. So they only did from the house to the first tank, but nothing else was done. That buyer's agent is going to be on the phone with their lawyer saying that your seller didn't do what they were supposed to do, which is actually not correct. Your seller did what they thought they were supposed to do, but it wasn't spelled out clearly. Because you as an agent know that that's not spelled out clearly and you didn't address it and have it fixed, you've left your seller open to a bad experience on closing. Okay, so we might not go back and say, correct the clause by saying holdbacks and all that stuff if it's not done, because we're working for the seller, not the buyer. But we do want to make sure that it's very clearly written so that the expectation is this is what's being done, nothing less, nothing more. And then all parties know. The buyer's agent on day of closing can't say, that's not what we asked for. That wasn't done right. Oh, yes, it is. Here it is, very clearly written that it was the line from the house to the tank. Does that make sense to everybody? I know, Matt, most of this probably won't apply to you, but you'll get some good little tidbits. I mean, always remembering who you're working for is the most important piece of real estate. And we get so busy and we're running around. Yeah, you get running around with people and you need to sometimes step back and go, wait a minute, who am I working for?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely finding it valuable, so thank you.
Good, good. Okay, so how does a poorly written contract affect my client if I don't correct it? Well, we just discussed that. It's the same as when I talked earlier about, you show up on closing day and something's wrong for the buyer. They forget that you got them an excellent price. It's no different with the seller. They're looking at you to be their first line of communication and or protection. You need to advise them in every way throughout the whole entire deal. So if you didn't protect them by allowing them to accept a poorly written amendment, they're going to be very upset. And rightfully so. The day of closing is stressful, even for a seller. I mean, the seller's already moved out, so let's imagine the seller is buying another property. They need the funds from this property to close on the other property. You've got a big snowball effect if things get caught up on closing day and get delayed because of a poorly written clause. And I will suggest at any time, if you're not sure if a clause is written good enough, one of the broker team, we review clauses for agents all the time. We don't mind. If you can't get one of us, don't worry about the broker line. Just go down the list until you get one of us. If it's a 911 situation, you text 911 to whomever one of us. It doesn't matter which one. If I get a 911 text from one of you agents and I literally cannot deal with it, I will forward that on to Melissa or Sherry or Ann. Between the four of us, it's rare that you're not going to get one of us in a fairly, in a timely manner. Now, Ann and I do joke. She's the late night girl and I'm the early morning girl. So don't be texting me at 11 o'clock at night because you're not going to get me. But you'll get her. Okay. Now, honestly, most things at 11 o'clock at night are not at a 911 because nothing's going to happen overnight. But it just might be that extreme that you can't sleep and you just really need our advice. Like, you'll most likely get her. Okay. So we talked about number 4. So now number 5 is the practice writing sample clauses. So I think this is a little easier to do in person. I'm not quite sure how well this is going to work here, but let's give it a go. So I've just got Google Docs up. I'm just going to turn my camera off here because I have to move my phone or my computer, sorry. And I'm putting it at an angle that would not look good on, on Zoom. So, okay. You'd be looking at a body part of mine that does not need to be on camera. we'll just leave it at that for the ladies. Okay, so I want you guys to, I'll be the scribe. I want someone to walk me through, we want the seller to replace an oil tank. How do we start the sentence?
The seller at the seller's expense.
Okay, the seller at the seller's expense. And I will tell you, I cannot type when I've got somebody watching me type, so. Okay. Okay, Joanne, we'll let you pick.
Will replace the existing oil tank.
Okay.
With a new.
Go for the fiberglass.
With a new fiberglass oil tank. of the same size, or the same size, a new fiberglass of the same size and quality.
Same size and quality?
Well, yeah, now we're kind of, okay. And I've got a closing, and I'm just getting a voicemail on the phone, so I'm like, okay. I just
Oh,
lost
shoot.
it. No, we're good. Okay.
Okay.
Oil tank of the same size and quality, to be installed by a qualified professional.
Ah. Okay. Okay, you good with that?
My
No,
only issue with that,
we're not finished yet.
Okay.
Ow.
Okay, continue on. And this is not a test, like it's all, this is interactive, so. Do you want to continue, Joanne, or do you want me to pass this on to somebody else to join in?
If somebody wants to do it, I can continue, or you can. Okay, I'll do this one because we've gone through this a bit.
Okay.
So then we put work to be done by. Okay, so if we assume their closing is I don't know, July 20th, work to be done by July 15th, and receipts to be provided at that time.
Okay.
If work is not done, $2,500 will be held in trust by the lawyer.
Okay.
To complete the above work.
Okay.
Upon closing.
Okay. Pretty good. We're going to add a few little tweaks. Okay. And this on its own is like almost bulletproof. It's just not 100% bulletproof. Okay. And this is why I'm doing it with you guys, because, and again, I'm also going to say, Joanne, it's really hard to do this verbally. So for the others that are listening, if any one of you call me and ask me to spew off a clause to you, it's all extremely important. I'm someone that's got to see something. I spell it out, then I go back and I fix it 3 or 4 times. So for the most part, so there's a couple little things, and they're very minor, honestly. So to be held in trust by the lawyer. Okay.
Oh.
So buyer's lawyer.
Buyer's lawyer.
By the buyer's lawyer. Okay, so if work is not done, $2,500, that was just a typo here for me, will be held in trust by the buyer's lawyer. And then, and here I got to work on my wording. So, be held in trust by the buyer's lawyer. And then this piece here is just verbally a little awkward. So here I would normally say, to be held in trust by the buyer's lawyer, comma, upon completion of work, any access funds will be, again, I can't type, returned to the seller's lawyer. Okay, just like I said, that's a very slight tweak. The seller, at the seller's expense, will replace the existing oil tank with a new fiberglass oil tank of the same size and quality. So just be careful on that, because if there was a fiberglass oil tank already in place, there's a very strong possibility you would not be replacing it. They're good for like 35 years. Okay, so the same size and quality is very important, like with a hot water tank. Or something like that. But with an oil tank, if you're going from oil to fiberglass, then actually you're going to a better quality. So I wouldn't even put that in this particular example. I might put 200 gallon in though, because there might still be some years ago, and I haven't ran into it lately, but years ago there were oil tanks that were half the size of the ones that we currently have in residential homes. They were geared for mini homes. I don't know if they still exist, but just to be on the safe side, we'll replace the existing oil tank with a new 200-gallon fiberglass tank. I don't think it was tank. Yeah. Okay. So that was good. To be installed by qualified professional. Work to be done by July 15th and receipts to be provided at that time. Perfect. Okay. So you had all the essentials. We just tweaked the wording slightly. Okay. I don't think the only thing in a broker review that may have come back on that was that it needed to specifically say the buyer's lawyer. Okay. You can see why. We don't want the seller's lawyer having anything to do with it. Okay. So no, that was really good. Does anyone want to do a septic one? The septic one is a little bit more complicated. How about we do it together? Okay, the sellers, at their expense, will have, and again, we've got to watch typing here, will have the septic tank and the entire disposal system, I can't spell, replaced with a new. Now, there is different types of septic systems. Okay, there's pump up systems, there's sand filtering systems, there's 3 or 4 different types. So depending on the area you're in, here in the valley, our sand sloping seem to be our most affordable and our newest type. And as long as there's a nice slope to the land, they're the ones that tend to be put in. You'll know this because you'll have this all done by a quote as to what's expected to be done. So as much detail as what you have, it's better, right? So this is going to say in this example, a new sand filter system. And will be installed by, now, if you want the specific company to do it, it could be XYZ Plumbers to do it. You can literally ask for your guy to do it, okay? Or failing which, installed by a QP2 installer. Okay. So now we've got the sellers, we've got who's paying for it, what it is they're going to do, and the specifics of what type of system we want it put in and by who is allowed to put it in. Okay. So now what are we going to do? What's
When
our
do
next?
you want it? Oh,
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Timeline.
Timeline, exactly. And you notice I'm putting in the year. All of our dates with real estate, make sure you spell out the year. Okay. So now I've asked for the work to be done by what date? What else? Now what am I missing?
Proof.
Perfect. And when would you ask for this? This is a closing of July 30th.
July 25th
Perfect.
or 26. Well,
Or 26.
yeah.
Yeah, you could allow them a couple days.
Yeah.
It's not wrong to pay the same day. It's just, you know, if they didn't literally get the work done to the 25th, it's hard for them to get the receipts to you by that same date. And if they don't get the receipts by the date you've asked, they're in violation of the contract. Okay. So I normally would do, 2 days in the future, but it really just depends because, again, one can say, well, we've clearly laid out to them. So seller, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, make sure you get the work done in like July the 23rd. Don't wait till the 25th to do it. We have to remember the different humans we're working with. Everyone has different thought processes, and some people will leave things to the very latest, especially with the cost of a septic. Okay. These things can cost $15,000, $20,000, right? So they may be leaving it closer to the closing date so that they can pay the company once they get the money from the closing costs. So now we've asked for who's paying for it, who's doing it, what it is we want, when it's to be done, proof of it, and now what?
What happens if it isn't done?
Awesome. You've won the prize. So failing which is all you've got to put on any one of these. Failing which, geez, I've got my office falling apart here on me. Sorry guys, just a second. I'm glad the camera's not on. Okay, just had I'm trying to start using a bulletin board to keep me as reminders, and anyway, it fell. Failing which, a holdback of, now, in this particular case, we've had my septic guy who I use all the time down here. He's gone, he's tested it, he knew it failed. He's going to install it because he's a licensed QP too. I don't have to make up a number or bring somebody else or anything. I've got the number. So I know it's going to be 15,000. Actually, it's going to be slightly less than this. I tried it. If I'm giving them the written quote, which you should do, you got to pretty much stay within that realm. But I'm still asking for a couple $100 more because, you know, things can change slightly on jobs, right?
Tammy, I have a question.
Yep.
Okay, so in the past, I've been asked, when writing out your figures, so you have your $15,000 there, should we be writing that amount out and then having your $15,000 beside it?
No, I don't do that.
No, okay.
No, I don't do that.
No. Yeah, I was corrected on it. It's been a while, but
was it a broker that corrected you on it or another agent?
No, broker.
No,
it would have been a while. Yeah, a while back. Just
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's not a bad habit. I mean, it's no different. I don't know why we don't do that when we do on the APS. We say, you know, the purchase price and we write it in both. So it's not a bad habit, but it's certainly not anything that's ever came up on broker review. Now, bear in mind, every year the commission does with their audits, and sometimes they change things. So what I'm saying today may not, you know, next year we might be saying something different. But if that's the case, we would do a memo, right? Held by the buyer's lawyer in trust. On completion work, any access, oh my goodness. To the seller's lawyer. So do you remember why I said that I add in this last piece upon completion of the work?
Just to keep the seller calm that the extra money is going to come back to them.
Exactly, if there is extra money left over.
Yeah.
Because, so let's say like maybe the quote for this was $14,250, right? So I wrote in 15,000 just to make sure that there wasn't any extra cost. There usually isn't, because I mean this work's normally going to be done within a couple months. You know, maybe even a month. So I'm not suggesting the price is going to change a whole lot. That's just my, that's just what I do. Okay. So you can do either. You will be providing the other side with these quotes though, so they actually have them. And that's important so that the seller believes that you're not just pulling money numbers out of the air. Even though you've put upon completion, excess money is to be returned, some sellers still will lose their mind when they see a number of $15,000 and they'd be like, where did you ever get that? So it's good if you can provide the quote when necessary. Okay. Now a couple other little tidbits that I want to, because we're 3 o'clock, I want to open up to questions here in a minute, but a couple little things that I want to point out to you guys. So once you've written and had a broker approve a oil tank clause, a septic clause, a hot water tank clause, you literally can keep that clause and use it for just about anything that needs to be done in real estate. Okay. So under your CREA clauses, you have the ability to have your own clauses so that you don't have to, at 10 o'clock at night, be like, oh my God, my brain is dead. I can't think of the wording. How am I supposed to word that? What were those pieces? So when you go into web forms, you can save your own personal clauses. Okay. Has most people found that, how to do that in web forms? I'm not going to teach that right now because that's be another thing, and I'm still a little awkward myself on certain pieces of web forms. But if you need help doing that, reach out. But I literally, I have all kinds of clauses in here, backup offer clauses, you know, adding agents for open houses on your BDBAs. Oh, your SDBAs. Just because we're busy, we get going, we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. Once you've got your clauses nailed, you've got them nailed. You just might have to flip out, a few small words, but it wouldn't be anything that would be too intense. Now I'm going to open the floor to questions. Does anybody have any questions or anything that they've ran into in regards to clauses that they'd like to discuss? We all feel confident in going out and asking for something to be replaced? Awesome. Has any agents that have written these clauses to the other side had any pushback? Oh, excellent.
No.
Excellent. When they're clearly written and it's very understandable, you rarely would get pushback. If you ever get pushback, call one of the broker team. The broker team will call that agent's broker and very nicely discuss the reason why we're asking for things the way we're asking for them, okay? When you ever have any doubt about any of it, just call one of us and we'll walk you through it, or we'll get involved as necessary. And I will tell you, if we get involved, it's done in a very nice manner. It's not done in a way to try to upset the other agent because they don't know how to do their job. We never present it that way. We always present it as what's going to be the best for the consumer. Okay, so don't ever be scared to call one of us.
Okay.
Great. Well, if that's everything, that's like we're right on 3 o'clock, and I didn't even know if I'd be able to extend this clause to 3 o'clock. This class to 3 o'clock. So I guess it went well.
Thanks, Tammy.
Okay, thanks, guys. You guys have